I never thought I'd find terror in the monotonous hum of an engine, but that night, every rotation of my tires felt like a countdown to something I couldn't escape. It was supposed to be a routine run, just another late-night delivery to keep the world spinning while everyone else slept. The clock on my dash read 2:37 a.m. as I cruised down the empty highway, nothing but darkness and the occasional glimmer of reflective signs to keep me company. The radio crackled softly, some old country tune providing a familiar backdrop to the rhythm of the road. I'd been driving for hours, my eyes heavy but alert, scanning the asphalt ahead illuminated by my high beams. The coffee in my thermos had long gone cold, but I took another swig anyway, grimacing at the bitter taste. It was then, as I set the thermos back in its holder, that I first noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first I thought nothing of it. Another night owl, probably heading home from a late shift, or maybe another trucker on a similar route. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the vehicle wasn't passing or falling behind. It maintained a constant distance, perfectly matching my speed. A knot began to form in my stomach. I'm not usually the paranoid type, you can't be in this line of work. But something about the way those headlights bore into my mirrors set my teeth on edge. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just using me as a pace car, letting me navigate the dark road ahead. It wasn't uncommon. To test my theory, I eased off the gas, watching my speedometer drop from 65 to 60. The van, I could make out its boxy shape now, slowed too, maintaining that eerie, consistent gap. My heart rate picked up. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "You're being ridiculous," I muttered to myself, but the words sounded hollow in the quiet cab. I spotted a rest stop sign ahead and made a split-second decision. I flicked on my turn signal and began to decelerate. The van's headlights dimmed momentarily, and for a blissful second I thought they were continuing on. But then the white glow intensified again as the vehicle swung into the exit lane behind me. My hands tightened on the wheel, knuckles turning white. This was no coincidence. I canceled my turn signal at the last moment, swerving back onto the highway. The van followed suit, engine revving as it kept pace. Now my mind was racing, conjuring up every worst-case scenario. Was it a robbery attempt? Some sick game? I glanced at the locked case beside me, containing the night's shipment of pharmaceuticals. Valuable cargo, sure, but enough to warrant this kind of pursuit? I fumbled for my phone, cursing as I realized I had no signal out here in the middle of nowhere. The vast, empty landscape that usually brought me peace now felt oppressive, isolating. I was alone out here with whoever was in that van. My eyes darted between the road ahead and my mirrors, watching those unblinking headlights. They were closer now, the van's grille becoming visible. I could make out a dark shape behind the windshield, but couldn't discern any features. I pushed my truck faster, the engine protesting as I urged it beyond its usual limits. The speedometer crept up, 70, 75, 80. The van matched me effortlessly. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air blasting from the AC. I tried to focus on my breathing, on the road ahead, on anything but the growing sense of dread threatening to overwhelm me. A green mile marker flew past and I did some quick mental math. The next town was still 30 miles away. A lot can happen in 30 miles of empty highway. The van suddenly swerved, pulling alongside me in the left lane. My breath caught in my throat as I risked a glance over. The windows were tinted, revealing nothing of the driver or any passengers. As I watched, heart pounding, the passenger window began to lower. I braced myself, half expecting to see a gun barrel emerge. Instead, a hand appeared, gesturing frantically. I couldn't make out the face behind it, but the movement seemed urgent, almost desperate. For a moment, I hesitated. What if this wasn't a threat, but someone in trouble? The thought was barely formed before the van suddenly accelerated, cutting in front of me so abruptly I had to slam on my brakes. The back doors of the van flew open and I caught a glimpse of something that turned my blood to ice. A person. A woman, I think. Bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror. She thrashed against her restraints, trying to scream through the gag. Then, as quickly as the doors had opened, they slammed shut. The van's tires squealed as it took off, quickly disappearing into the darkness ahead. I sat there, stunned, my truck idling on the empty highway. My mind struggled to process what I'd just witnessed. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life, did they? But the image of that woman's terrified eyes was burned into my mind. This was real, and I was the only one who knew. With shaking hands, I put my truck in gear and accelerated. I had to do something. I couldn't just let them get away, but what could I do? I was just a delivery driver, not some action hero. I pushed my rig as fast as it would go, straining to catch sight of the van's taillights in the distance. My mind raced through options. Should I try to run them off the road? That seemed insane, not to mention dangerous for the woman inside. Could I somehow alert the authorities? But how, with no cell signal? As I rounded a bend, I spotted the van again, its shape unmistakable even at a distance. I was gaining on them, my larger engine giving me an advantage on the long, straight stretch of highway. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in my rearview mirror. A surge of relief washed over me until I realized the implications. The police car was after me, not the van. Of course it was. I was the one speeding like a maniac. I had a split second to make a decision. If I pulled over, I'd lose the van, but if I didn't, I'd have law enforcement chasing me instead of the real criminals. Gritting my teeth, I eased off the gas and pulled onto the shoulder. The police car stopped behind me, and I watched helplessly as the van's taillights grew smaller and eventually disappeared over a hill. My hands were shaking as I lowered my window. The officer approached, flashlight beam sweeping over my face. "License and registration," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "Do you know how fast you were going?" I fumbled with my wallet, my mind racing. How could I explain this? Would he even believe me? "Officer," I started, my voice quavering, "you have to listen to me. There's a van up ahead. They've kidnapped someone. A woman. I saw her." The officer's expression didn't change as he examined my license. "Sir, have you been drinking tonight?" "What? No!" I exclaimed, frustration building. I'm serious. We have to go after them." He sighed, shining his flashlight into my cab. "Step out of the vehicle, please." As I climbed down from the truck, legs unsteady, I realized how this must look. A wild-eyed trucker speeding down the highway, telling tales of kidnapping. I wouldn't believe me either. The next hour was a blur of sobriety tests, questions, and growing despair. By the time the officer was satisfied I wasn't under the influence, it was far too late. The van and the woman inside it were long gone. As the police car pulled away, leaving me with nothing but a speeding ticket and a warning, the weight of what had happened truly hit me. I slumped against my truck, the cold metal grounding me in a reality I didn't want to face. I had been the only one who could have helped her, and I had failed. The image of her terrified eyes would haunt me for years to come, I knew. Every time I saw a white van on the road, every late-night delivery, every lonely stretch of highway, I'd remember this night and the fate I couldn't change. As I climbed back into my cab, the familiar surroundings felt different now. The hum of the engine as I pulled back onto the road wasn't the comforting sound it had always been. Now it carried an undertone of dread, a reminder that sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones lurking in the shadows. They're the ones driving right alongside us, hiding in plain sight on the empty highways of the night. I completed my delivery that night, going through the motions like a man in a daze, but as I signed off on my paperwork and headed home, I knew nothing would ever be the same. The open road, once my refuge, now felt like a hunting ground, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there those headlights might appear in my mirror again, bringing with them a terror I never asked to know. Story 2. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing prepared me for the night I watched a man die. It wasn't the death that haunts me, it was the cold efficiency of it all. The sun had just dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples when I started the climb up into the mountains. My rig groaned as I downshifted, the heavy load of lumber in the trailer making itself known on every switchback. I'd done this route 100 times, but something about tonight felt different. The air was thick with tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. I flicked on my high beams as darkness settled in, casting long shadows across the winding road. The radio crackled with static. No stations reached this far into the wilderness. It was just me, the rumble of my engine, and the looming silhouettes of pines against a star-studded sky. About an hour into the climb, I spotted headlights in my rearview mirror. It was unusual to see anyone else up here this late, but I didn't think much of it. Probably just some tourist who'd underestimated the drive time to their cabin rental. The vehicle, I could make out an SUV now, was gaining on me fast. I hugged the right side of the lane, giving them plenty of room to pass on the rare straight stretches. But they didn't. They just sat there, riding my tail, high beams flashing occasionally. "Come on, buddy," I muttered, tapping my brakes lightly. "Pass or back off." As if hearing me, the SUV suddenly swerved into the oncoming lane. I tensed, ready for them to zip by. Instead, they paced me, keeping level with my cab. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't right. I chanced to glance over. The SUV's windows were tinted, but I could make out at least 3 shadowy figures inside. The passenger window rolled down, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable silhouette of a gun. My heart pounding, I faced forward again, knuckles white on the steering wheel. What the hell was going on? Suddenly, the SUV accelerated, cutting in front of me so close I had to slam on my brakes. The trailer jackknifed slightly, and I fought to keep control as we rounded a sharp bend. When we straightened out, I saw why they'd made their move. Up ahead, a man stood by a stalled car, arm outstretched in the universal hitchhiker's pose. Relief flooded through me. Witnesses. Safety in numbers. Surely whatever these guys were planning, they wouldn't try anything with someone else around. How wrong I was. The SUV screeched to a halt next to the stranded motorist. I was still a good 100 yards back, my rig's momentum slow to bleed off on the incline. I watched, confusion turning to horror as 2 men leapt from the SUV. Even from this distance, the metallic glint of their pistols was unmistakable in my headlights. The hitchhiker must have realized the danger too late. He turned to run, but he had nowhere to go. The mountain dropped off steeply on one side, and a sheer rock face rose on the other. I was close enough now to see the terror on his face as the men grabbed him. There was a brief struggle, a flash of silver as moonlight caught on a blade. Then 3 sharp cracks split the night. Gunshots. The hitchhiker crumpled to the ground. I was almost upon them now, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. But even as I thought it, I watched the 2 men drag the lifeless body to the edge of the road. With practiced ease, they heaved it over the side. There was no scream, no dramatic tumbling of the corpse down the mountainside. Just a soft thump as it hit the dense undergrowth below, swallowed up by the darkness. The killers turned towards my approaching truck. I had seconds to decide. Ram them? Try to swerve around? My body made the choice for me, foot easing off the gas as I slowed to a stop about 50 feet from the scene. For a long moment, nobody moved. I sat there, engine idling, staring at the men who'd just committed cold-blooded murder. They stared back, guns still in hand. Then, with a casualness that chilled me to my core, they simply got back in their SUV. The driver flashed his high beams at me once, like some twisted thank you for my cooperation. And then they were gone, taillights disappearing around the next bend. I don't know how long I sat there, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It might have been minutes or hours. Eventually, I managed to shift into gear and ease my rig forward. As I passed the spot where the man had died, I saw dark stains on the asphalt. My headlights illuminated the hitchhiker's car, driver's side door still ajar. A duffel bag lay spilled onto the road. Clothes and toiletries scattered like the forgotten props of a life suddenly cut short. I should have stopped, should have called for help. But a primal fear had taken hold, screaming at me to get as far away from this place as possible. So I drove, hands shaking on the wheel, the image of that man's final moments seared into my mind. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. I made my delivery at the lumberyard just as dawn was breaking, going through the motions like a man sleepwalking. I signed the paperwork without really seeing it, deaf to the foreman's attempts at small talk. It wasn't until I was halfway home, the mountain passes far behind me, that the full weight of what I'd witnessed came crashing down. I pulled into a rest stop, stumbled out of my cab, and was violently sick in the sparse grass by the parking lot. As I splashed water on my face in the grimy restroom, I caught sight of my reflection. I looked like a ghost, pale and haunted. In that moment, I made a decision that would gnaw at me for years to come. I couldn't report what I'd seen. The rational part of my brain argued against this. I was a witness to murder. I had a moral obligation, a civic duty to come forward. But a deeper, more primal part of me knew the truth. Those men were professionals. The ease with which they'd killed, the coordinated way they'd operated, this wasn't their first rodeo. And if I came forward, I'd be painting a target on my back. How long before an SUV with tinted windows started following me on my routes? How long before I became another body tossed carelessly off a mountain road? So I kept quiet. I went home, hugged my wife a little tighter than usual, and tried to lose myself in the mundane rhythms of life between hauls. But the guilt ate at me. Every time I saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I'd break out in a cold sweat. Every news report about missing persons or unidentified remains found in the wilderness made my stomach churn. Months passed. I took fewer mountain routes, making excuses to stick to the lowland interstates. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of a dark SUV in my mirrors and my heart would race, only for it to turn out to be a soccer mom on a grocery run. It was almost a year to the day when it happened. I was at a truck stop refueling and grabbing a quick bite when I overheard a conversation that made my blood run cold. "Yeah, they found another one up in the hills," a grizzled trucker was saying to his buddy. "Just like the others. Single gunshot, body dumped off the road. Cops are saying it might be the work of some organized outfit." I froze, coffee cup halfway to my lips. The trucker continued, oblivious to my reaction. "Guess they've linked it to at least 5 other murders in the past couple years. All along that same stretch of mountain highway. They're calling him the Ridge Runner Killer." My hands shook as I set down my mug. 5 other murders. How many more had there been that were never discovered? How many families were out there wondering what had happened to their loved ones, while I sat on the knowledge that could bring them closure? The guilt I'd been carrying for a year crystallized in that moment into resolve. I couldn't stay silent any longer. The risk to myself no longer seemed to matter in the face of potentially saving future victims. As I climbed into my rig that evening, I pulled out my phone. My finger hovered over the keypad, the non-emergency number for the state police taunting me. Could I really do this? Could I upend my life, potentially put myself and my family in danger? But then I remembered the look of terror on that hitchhiker's face in the split second before the guns went off. I remembered the casual way his killers had tossed him aside, like he was nothing more than roadkill. I took a deep breath and dialed. "State Police, how can I assist you?" I need to report a murder," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And I think I might know who's behind the Ridge Runner killings." As I began to recount that terrible night, I felt a weight lifting. I didn't know what would happen next, if I'd be believed, if the killers would be caught, or if I was signing my own death warrant. But I knew I was finally doing the right thing. The open road had always been my home, a place of freedom and endless possibility. Now it felt dangerous, tainted. But as I pulled out of the truck stop and merged onto the highway, I realized something. We can't control the dark things that happen in this world, but we can choose how we respond to them. And sometimes that choice makes all the difference. Story 3. They say every object tells a story, but some stories are better left untold. I learned that the hard way on a crisp autumn morning when I found a hand in a garbage bag. Just a hand, severed, pale, and as cold as the dawn air that clung to my skin. I'd been driving garbage routes for nearly 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. Rats big as cats scurrying from dumpsters. The occasional dead pet some heartbroken kid couldn't bear to bury. Once I even found a stash of counterfeit bills that had the cops crawling all over my truck for weeks. But nothing could have prepared me for this. The day started like any other. I rolled out of bed at 4 a.m., kissed my sleeping wife on the forehead, and shuffled into the kitchen. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the air with the rich aroma that never failed to jolt me awake. I glanced at the fridge, covered in my daughter's artwork and school announcements, a reminder of why I dragged myself out of bed at ungodly hours to drive a glorified dumpster on wheels. The streets were empty as I pulled out of the driveway, save for the occasional early morning jogger or bleary-eyed shift worker. I nodded to Old Man Jenkins as I passed, already on his porch with a steaming mug, same as every morning. The familiar rhythm of the route settled over me like a well-worn jacket. It wasn't until I hit Maple Street that things went sideways. I just hoisted a particularly heavy can into the truck when I noticed something off. A black garbage bag tied neatly with a red ribbon sat apart from the other trash. It hadn't been there yesterday, and it was too early for the homeowners to have put it out this morning. Curiosity got the better of me. I should have just tossed it in with the rest and gone about my day. But something about that red ribbon nagged at me. Who ties up their garbage like a Christmas present? I hefted the bag, surprised by its weight. Whatever was inside shifted, and I felt something solid bump against my leg through the plastic. Probably just some kids playing a prank, I thought. Filling a bag with rocks or something equally asinine. I set it down on the edge of the truck and untied the ribbon. The plastic crinkled as I peeled it back, and that's when the smell hit me. Sharp, metallic, with an undercurrent of something sickeningly sweet. My stomach lurched, but morbid fascination kept my hands moving. Inside, nestled among crumpled newspapers, was a human hand. I stumbled back, my foot catching on the curb. I went down hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. For a long moment, I just lay there on the cold concrete, staring up at the sky and trying to convince myself I hadn't seen what I knew I had. But when I finally dragged myself up, the bag was still there. The hand still visible, fingers curled slightly as if reaching for help that would never come. My mind raced. I should call the cops. That's what any sane person would do. But as I fumbled for my phone, a thought stopped me cold. What if they thought I had something to do with this? I was the one who opened the bag, after all. My fingerprints would be all over it. Panic started to set in. I paced back and forth, running my hands through my thinning hair. Think. Damn it. Think. That's when I noticed the house. In all the chaos, I hadn't really registered where I was. But now, staring at the perfectly manicured lawn and gleaming BMW in the driveway, recognition dawned. This was the Andersons' place. Tom Anderson was some hotshot lawyer downtown. His wife Sheila was always organizing charity events and PTA meetings. They had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both in high school now. Picture-perfect family, at least on the surface. But there had always been whispers, raised voices late at night, the occasional bruise Sheila tried to cover with makeup, Tom's reputation for being a little too friendly with his female colleagues. I found myself wondering, was this Tom's handiwork? Or had Sheila finally snapped after years of God knows what behind closed doors? The sound of a door opening snapped me back to reality. I whirled around to see Tom himself stepping out onto the porch, briefcase in hand. He froze when he saw me, his eyes darting from my face to the open bag by the truck. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I could see the gears turning behind his eyes, weighing options, formulating a plan. Then he smiled. It was all teeth and cold calculation. "Morning, Jack," he called out, his voice steady. "Everything all right?" I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Morning, Mr. Anderson. Just a little trouble with one of the bags. Nothing to worry about." He nodded, but his eyes never left mine. "Well, I appreciate all you do. Keeping our streets clean and all that." The double meaning wasn't lost on me. He started down the driveway, each step measured and deliberate. I tensed, ready for... what? An attack? A bribe? A threat? But he just walked past me, climbed into his BMW, and drove away. As if it were any other morning. As if there wasn't a severed hand sitting in a garbage bag not 10 feet from where he stood. As soon as he was out of sight, I sprang into action. I snatched up the bag, tying it shut with shaking hands. Without thinking, I tossed it into the back of the truck along with the rest of the trash. The hydraulic press whirred to life, crushing and compacting. I watched as the bag disappeared among the rest of the neighborhood's refuse. In moments it was gone. Just another piece of garbage in a sea of waste. I climbed back into the cab, my heart pounding. What had I just done? I destroyed evidence. Became an accessory to... what? Murder? Dismemberment? But a small selfish part of me felt relief. The problem was gone, ground up and on its way to the landfill. No one would ever know. I finished my route on autopilot, barely registering the familiar streets and houses. My mind kept replaying that moment of discovery, Tom's calculating stare, the sickening crunch as the compactor did its work. When I finally pulled into the depot, my supervisor, Mike, was waiting for me. His brow furrowed as I climbed down from the cab. "You all right, Jack? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Just a long day, boss. Nothing a cold beer won't fix." He didn't look convinced, but he let it go. As I walked to my car, I could feel his eyes on my back. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see police lights flashing behind me. but there was nothing. Just the usual afternoon traffic and my own paranoid thoughts. I pulled into my driveway and sat there, engine idling. Through the window, I could see my daughter at the kitchen table, probably working on homework. My wife moved around the kitchen, preparing dinner. The normalcy of it all felt surreal after the morning I'd had. A decision crystallized in my mind. I couldn't tell them, couldn't burden them with this knowledge. This would be my secret to carry. As I walked through the door, my daughter looked up with a smile. "Dad, you're home early." I forced a grin. "Thought I'd surprise you all. How about we order pizza tonight?" My wife raised an eyebrow. Pizza on a weeknight was against the usual rules, but nodded. "Everything okay, honey? You look a little pale." I crossed the room and pulled her into a hug, probably a bit too tight. "Everything's fine, just glad to be home." That night, as my family chatted and laughed over pepperoni and cheese, I sat in silence. The weight of the day's events pressed down on me, threatening to suffocate. But I smiled and nodded at all the right moments, playing the part of the contented husband and father. As I lay in bed that night, sleep eluding me, I thought about Tom Anderson. Was he lying awake too, wondering if I'd go to the police, or was he sleeping soundly, confident in the knowledge that his secret was safe? I thought about the hand. Who did it belong to? Was there a family out there desperately searching for a missing loved one? Would they ever know the truth? And I thought about myself. The man I'd been yesterday, just an ordinary guy doing an honest job, seemed a lifetime away. Now I was, what? An accomplice? A coward? Both? I told myself I'd done the only thing I could, that going to the police would have torn my family apart, exposed us to danger. But in the quiet darkness of night, those justifications rang hollow. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I made a promise to myself. I would watch. I would listen. And if I ever caught even a hint that Tom Anderson was hurting someone else, I'd bring the whole truth to light, consequences be damned. But for now, the weight of silence would be mine to bear, a garbage man carrying the heaviest load of all. Story 4. I never thought a simple address could be a death sentence. But as I stood there, surrounded by masked figures with guns trained on me, I realized just how wrong I'd been. It was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday. Wake up, kiss the wife goodbye, climb into my beat-up delivery van, and spend the day dropping off packages to smiling or sometimes grumpy faces across the city. The usual dance of schedules, traffic, and the occasional barking dog. The morning went smoothly enough. A few signature-required deliveries that had me drumming my fingers impatiently while retirees shuffled to their doors. A close call with a sprinkler system that nearly soaked a box of what I assume were electronics. You know, the regular thrills of a delivery driver's life. It wasn't until after lunch that things went sideways. I just polished off a slightly squashed tuna sandwich in the van, parked in the shade of a massive oak tree. As I was brushing crumbs off my uniform, my phone pinged with a notification. An urgent delivery added to my route marked high priority. I frowned at the screen. It wasn't unusual to get last-minute additions, but something about this one felt off. The address was in a part of town I rarely visited, an industrial area full of warehouses and storage units. Not exactly prime real estate for home deliveries. But hey, I didn't make the rules, I just delivered the packages. So I punched the address into my GPS and set off, the van's engine protesting slightly as I merged back into traffic. The drive took me through progressively less populated areas. Tidy suburban homes gave way to strip malls, then to vast empty lots punctuated by the occasional factory or truck depot. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt, and I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. When I finally pulled up to the address, I double-checked my phone. This couldn't be right. The building before me was a massive, dilapidated warehouse. Faded lettering on the side proclaimed it the former home of Johnson & Sons Manufacturing, though it looked like the Johnsons and their sons had cleared out decades ago. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, debating whether to call dispatch, but I could already hear the annoyed voice of my supervisor. "Just deliver the package, Jack. That's your job, isn't it?" With a sigh, I killed the engine and climbed out, package tucked under my arm. It wasn't particularly heavy, about the size of a shoebox. As I approached the building, I noticed a single door set into the corrugated metal wall. No doorbell, no signs of life. I knocked, the sound echoing hollowly. Nothing. I was just about to turn back to the van when I heard it, the faint scrape of metal on concrete from inside. Then slowly the door creaked open. A face peered out, partially obscured by the dim interior. A man, maybe in his 40s, with deep-set eyes that darted nervously from me to the street behind. "Package for..." I glanced at the label. "Mr. Smith." He nodded quickly. "Yes, that's me. Bring it inside, please." Warning bells were going off in my head. Every instinct screamed that this was wrong, that I should turn and run. But years of customer service training kicked in, that ingrained need to please overriding common sense. I stepped inside. The interior was vast and shadowy, dust motes dancing in the few shafts of sunlight that penetrated the grimy windows. As my eyes adjusted, I became aware of movement in the gloom, figures emerging from behind rusted machinery and forgotten crates. "I just need a signature," I said, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous space. I fumbled for my electronic pad, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck. That's when I heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "I'm afraid," said a new voice, low and menacing, "that won't be necessary." I turned slowly, heart hammering in my chest. 5 men stood in a loose semicircle around me, each wearing a black mask that covered the lower half of their face, and each one was holding a gun pointed squarely at my chest. "Look," I said, raising my hand slowly, the package dropping to the floor with a dull thud. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just doing my job." The man who had spoken, clearly the leader, stepped forward. He was tall, with piercing blue eyes that regarded me coldly above his mask. "And what exactly do you think that job is?" he asked, his tone almost conversational. I blinked, confused. "Delivering packages?" He chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, my friend, you've been delivering so much more than that." With a nod to one of his men, he bent down and picked up the fallen package. Using a knife that seemed to materialize from nowhere, he slid open the brown paper wrapping. My confusion turned to horror as he upended the box. Bundles of cash spilled out, along with several small bags of white powder. "You see," the leader continued, "you've been an integral part of our operation for months now. The perfect, unsuspecting mule." My mind reeled. How many of these special deliveries had I made? How long had I been an unwitting part of whatever this was? Drugs? Money laundering? "I didn't know," I stammered. I swear I had no idea. The leader tilted his head, studying me. "No, I don't suppose you did. That's what made you so perfect." One of the other men spoke up, his voice gruff. "We should just kill him. He's seen too much." I felt the blood drain from my face. This couldn't be happening. I thought of my wife waiting at home, the dinner plans we'd made for the weekend, the future we'd planned, now potentially evaporating in this godforsaken warehouse. "Please," I said, hating the desperation in my voice but unable to stop it. "I won't say anything. I'll quit my job, move away. You'll never hear from me again." The leader held up a hand, silencing his trigger-happy companion. Now, let's not be hasty. Our friend here might still be of use to us." He stepped closer and I fought the urge to back away. "You've done well, even if unknowingly, but now you have a choice to make. You can join us, fully aware this time. Good money, exciting work, or..." He let the alternative hang in the air, unspoken but crystal clear. My mind raced. Was he seriously offering me a job? As what, a drug runner? Could I even consider it? The faces of my family flashed before my eyes, my parents, my wife, my sister, and her kids. What would they think if they knew? But then again, what would they think if I ended up as another unsolved murder, my body dumped in some back alley? I don't know," I managed to croak out. The leader nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "It's a big decision. Tell you what, we'll give you 24 hours to think it over." He gestured, and one of his men approached, holding out a burner phone. "We'll call you tomorrow, same time. You'll give us your answer then. But remember," his eyes hardened, "if you go to the police, if you try to run, we'll know. And we'll find you." With that, they melted back into the shadows of the warehouse, leaving me alone with the phone and my racing thoughts. I don't remember the drive home. One moment I was standing in that warehouse, the next I was pulling into my driveway, hands shaking on the steering wheel. My wife greeted me at the door with a smile that quickly faded as she saw my face. "Jack, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I brushed past her, heading straight for the liquor cabinet. As I poured myself a generous whiskey, I could feel her concerned gaze on my back. "Tough day at work," I muttered, downing the drink in one go. That night, as she slept peacefully beside me, I lay awake, the burner phone sitting like a ticking time bomb on the nightstand. Every scenario I played out in my head ended badly. Go to the police? My family could be in danger. Run? They said they'd find me. Join them? Throw away everything I've ever believed in? Become a criminal? As dawn broke, I was no closer to a decision. I went through the motions of getting ready for work, kissing my wife goodbye as if it were any other day. But as I climbed into my van, I realized I couldn't do this alone. I needed help, advice, something. With trembling fingers, I dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Hello," came the gruff voice on the other end. "Dad," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm in trouble, real trouble. I need your help." There was a pause then. "I'm listening, son." As I poured out the whole sordid story, I felt a small glimmer of hope. I didn't know what the next 24 hours would bring, but at least now I wasn't facing it alone. The burner phone sat heavy in my pocket, a constant reminder that the clock was ticking. Whatever choice I made, I knew one thing for certain: my life as I knew it was over. The only question was, what would rise from its ashes? Story 5. I've driven through hell and back, but nothing could have prepared me for the night I crossed Devil's Pass with Death riding shotgun. It was supposed to be a routine haul. Just another long-distance run from Denver to Seattle, the kind I'd done 100 times before. But as I pulled out of the depot that evening, there was a charge in the air, a restlessness that set my teeth on edge. The weather report had warned of a storm system moving in, but I figured I could outrun it. I'd pushed through worse, and the promise of a fat bonus for early delivery was too tempting to pass up. Besides, I had a reputation to uphold. 15 years on the road, and I'd never missed a deadline. The first few hours were uneventful. I settled into the familiar rhythm of the highway, my rig eating up the miles as darkness fell. The radio kept me company, a mix of classic rock and late-night talk shows. But as I crossed into Idaho, the static started creeping in, voices fading in and out like ghosts in the night. That's when I saw the first snowflakes. They danced in my headlights, delicate and innocent. But I knew better. Up here in the mountains, weather could turn deadly in an instant. I glanced at my GPS, weighing my options. The main highway would add hours to my trip, but it was safer. The alternative was Devil's Pass, a treacherous stretch of mountain road that cut straight through the heart of the Rockies. Common sense said to take the long way round, but the clock was ticking, and that bonus was calling my name. With a muttered curse, I made the turn onto the pass. The snow picked up almost immediately, fat flakes obscuring my windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. The road narrowed, hugging the mountainside with sheer drops just inches from my tires. My knuckles went white on the steering wheel as I navigated hairpin turns, the trailer swaying dangerously behind me. An hour in, and I was starting to regret my decision. The storm had become a full-on blizzard, wind howling like a banshee as it battered my rig. Visibility was down to almost nothing. I was driving by instinct now, following the ghostly shapes of reflective markers that lined the road. That's when I saw it, a flicker of light through the swirling snow. As I drew closer, it resolved into hazard lights. A car pulled off to the side of the road, half buried in a snowdrift. Every instinct told me to keep going. In weather like this, stopping could mean death. But I couldn't shake the image of someone trapped in that car, slowly freezing as help passed them by. With a silent prayer, I eased my rig onto the shoulder, wincing at the crunch of metal on ice. Grabbing my heavy coat and a flashlight, I stepped out into the maelstrom. The wind nearly knocked me off my feet, icy fingers clawing at any exposed skin. I stumbled towards the car, my light barely penetrating the wall of white. As I reached the driver's side, I saw a figure slumped over the wheel. I pounded on the window, shouting to be heard over the storm. No response. With a surge of adrenaline, I wrenched the door open. The man inside was pale, his lips tinged blue. But as my light hit his face, his eyes fluttered open. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. "Help," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "Please." I didn't hesitate. Hooking my arms under his, I hauled him out of the car. He was dead weight, his legs buckling as I half-carried, half-dragged him towards my truck. The few yards felt like miles, each step a battle against the driving snow and numbing cold. Finally, we reached the cab. I muscled him into the passenger seat before climbing in myself, slamming the door against the howling wind. For a moment, we just sat there, gasping for breath in the sudden silence. "Thank you," the man said, his teeth chattering. I thought I was done for." I cranked up the heat, grabbing a blanket from behind the seat and tossing it to him. "What the hell were you doing out here?" He huddled under the blanket, slowly regaining some color. "Stupid mistake. Thought I could make it through before the storm hit. Car died about an hour ago." I nodded, understanding all too well the kind of overconfidence that could lead to such a situation. "I'm Jake," I said, offering my hand. He took it, his grip surprisingly firm. "Michael." As Michael warmed up, I weighed our options. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and we were still a good 30 miles from the next town. Turning back wasn't an option. The road was too narrow, and in this weather, attempting to turn the rig around would be suicide. "We're going to have to push through," I said finally. "It's not safe to stay parked here. You okay to ride along?" Michael nodded, some of the fear leaving his eyes. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks again, man. You saved my life." I waved off his thanks, focusing on the treacherous task ahead. As I shifted into gear, I caught a glimpse of something in my side mirror, a dark shape moving through the snow. But when I looked again, it was gone. Must be seeing things, I thought. This damn storm's got me jumping at shadows. The next few hours were a nightmare. The pass climbed higher, the air growing thin as we ascended. The snow turned to ice, coating the road in a treacherous sheet. More than once, I felt the trailer start to jackknife, only barely managing to correct before we went over the edge. Michael remained silent for the most part, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But every so often, I'd catch him glancing nervously over his shoulder as if expecting to see something in the darkness behind us. We were nearing the summit when it happened. A gust of wind, stronger than any before, slammed into the side of the rig. I felt the wheels lose traction, the whole truck sliding sideways towards the guardrail. Time seemed to slow. I saw the flimsy metal barrier approaching, knew with sickening certainty that it wouldn't hold. Beyond it was nothing but blackness, a 1,000-foot drop into oblivion. I wrenched the wheel, fighting against physics and fate. The trailer fishtailed wildly, threatening to pull us over the edge. In that moment, I was certain we were going to die. Then miraculously, the tires found purchase. The rig shuddered, then straightened out. We skidded to a stop mere inches from the guardrail. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the idling engine and our ragged breathing. "That was—" Michael started, his voice shaky. "Yeah," I agreed, not needing him to finish the thought. As the adrenaline faded, I became aware of a new sound, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the trailer. Probably just shifted cargo, I told myself. But a nagging doubt took root in my mind. "Hey," I said, turning to Michael, "what did you say you do for a living?" He blinked, caught off guard by the sudden question. I didn't. I'm in acquisitions." "Acquisitions," I repeated, the word leaving a sour taste in my mouth. "And what exactly are you acquiring out here in the middle of nowhere?" Michael's expression hardened, the gratitude in his eyes replaced by something colder. "You know, Jake, curiosity can be a dangerous thing, especially in our line of work." My blood ran cold. "Our line of work?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Come on now. You didn't really think this was a coincidence, did you? A stranded motorist in the middle of a blizzard right along your route?" The thumping from the trailer grew louder, more insistent. "What's in my trailer, Michael?" I asked, though I was starting to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. He sighed, reaching into his coat. The glint of metal made my heart skip a beat. "Nothing you need to worry about. You've done your job, Jake. Delivered the package, just like always. Now it's time for you to take a little nap." As he raised the gun, time seemed to slow again. I saw my life flash before my eyes, not the cliché highlights reel, but all the small moments. The smell of my wife's hair, my daughter's laugh, the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. In that split second, I made a choice. With a roar of defiance, I threw myself at Michael. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the confined space. Pain blossomed in my shoulder, but adrenaline kept me moving. We grappled, a frenzied struggle in the cramped cab. My size gave me an advantage, but Michael fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. The gun went off again, shattering the windshield. Icy wind whipped through the cab, carrying with it the sound of sirens in the distance. Michael's eyes widened in panic. With a final surge of strength, I managed to wrench the gun from his grasp, sending it clattering to the floor. "It's over," I gasped, pinning him against the door. The look he gave me was one of pure venom. "You have no idea what you've done," he spat. As red and blue lights appeared through the swirling snow, I realized he was right. I didn't know what was in my trailer, didn't know who Michael really was or who he worked for. But I did know one thing: my life would never be the same. The storm continued to rage as state troopers approached, weapons drawn. But somehow I felt calmer than I had all night. I'd face death on Devil's Pass and come out the other side. Whatever came next, I'd face it head on. After all, that's what truckers do. We keep moving forward no matter what the road throws our way. Story 6. I've seen a lot of strange things on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found at Lou's Diner. It was supposed to be just another pit stop, a chance to refuel and grab a hot meal. Instead, I walked into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. The neon sign flickered weakly in the pre-dawn gloom as I pulled my rig into the nearly empty parking lot. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, my eyes gritty with fatigue and my back aching from too many miles hunched over the wheel. The promise of hot coffee and a greasy breakfast was all that kept me going. Lou's was one of those timeless roadside diners you find dotted across the country. Chrome and red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, and the ever-present smell of bacon and burnt coffee. I'd stopped here a dozen times before on my cross-country hauls. It wasn't anything special, but it was familiar, comfortable. As I killed the engine, I noticed something off. The lot was empty, save for a beat-up Chevy and a state trooper's cruiser. Not unusual for this time of night, but still a prickle of unease ran down my spine. I chalked it up to exhaustion and too much gas station coffee. The bell above the door jingled cheerfully as I stepped inside, the warm air a welcome respite from the chilly night. I expected to hear the usual clatter of plates and murmur of conversation. Instead, I was met with silence. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet diner. No response. I moved further in, the linoleum squeaking under my boots. That's when I saw the first body. A man in a rumpled suit slumped over in a booth. At first I thought he was just passed out drunk, but as I got closer I saw the pool of congealed blood on the table, the unnatural angle of his neck. My heart began to race. I spun around, suddenly hyper-aware of my surroundings, and that's when I saw the rest. A waitress by the counter, her order pad still clutched in her lifeless hand. An old couple in a corner booth, looking for all the world like they were just taking a nap together. And behind the counter, a heavy-set man in a grease-stained apron, Lou himself, I assumed, sprawled on the floor. The smell hit me then. That sickly sweet odor of death that no amount of diner grease could mask. I gagged, stumbling back towards the door. My mind reeled, unable to process what I was seeing. That's when I heard it. A soft whimper coming from the kitchen. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back in my truck and drive until this place was nothing but a bad memory in my rearview mirror. But I couldn't. Someone might still be alive back there. Someone might need help. With shaking hands, I grabbed a heavy coffee pot from the counter. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. Slowly, I edged towards the swinging kitchen doors. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Is someone there? I'm here to help." Another whimper, louder this time. Definitely human. Taking a deep breath, I pushed through the doors. The kitchen was a mess of overturned pots and scattered utensils. And there, huddled in the corner behind a prep table, was a young woman. Her uniform identified her as another waitress, though it was now stained with blood and tears. Her eyes widened in terror as she saw me. "Please," she sobbed, "please don't hurt me." I set the coffee pot down, raising my hands to show I meant no harm. "It's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm just a truck driver. What happened here?" She shook her head, her whole body trembling. "I don't know, it all happened so fast. One minute everything was normal, the next..." She broke off, a fresh wave of sobs racking her frame. I crouched down, keeping my distance so as not to frighten her further. "What's your name?" "Sarah," she managed between hiccuping breaths. "Okay, Sarah, I'm Jake. We need to get out of here, all right? Can you walk?" She nodded hesitantly. As she started to stand, her eyes suddenly went wide with fear. "Behind you!" she screamed. I spun around just in time to see a dark figure lunging at me. I caught a glimpse of wild eyes and something metallic glinting in the fluorescent light before I was knocked to the ground. The impact drove the air from my lungs. I felt a sharp pain in my side. A knife, I realized with dawning horror. I thrashed desperately, managing to knock my attacker off balance. As I scrambled to my feet, I got my first good look at him. He was young, maybe early 20s, with a gaunt face and eyes that burned with a manic intensity. Blood fresh and old stained his clothes. "You shouldn't have come here," he snarled, brandishing the knife. "This is my place now. My kingdom." I backed away, my hand pressed to the wound in my side. It didn't feel too deep, but warm blood seeped between my fingers. "Easy now," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "We don't want any trouble. Just let us go, and you'll never see us again." He laughed, a high-pitched giggle that sent chills down my spine. "Go. Oh no, no one leaves. You're all part of it now. Part of my masterpiece." From the corner of my eye, I saw Sarah inching towards the door. If I could just keep this lunatic distracted. "What masterpiece?" I asked, genuinely curious despite my fear. "What are you trying to do here?" His eyes lit up, as if he'd been waiting for someone to ask. "Can't you see? I'm remaking the world, starting right here. These people," he gestured vaguely towards the diner, "they were just the beginning. Flawed, imperfect. But in death, they become something beautiful, something pure." I felt sick. This guy was completely unhinged. "And what about us?" I asked, nodding towards Sarah. "Are we part of your masterpiece too?" He tilted his head, considering. "The girl, yes. She's been chosen. But you," his eyes narrowed, "you don't belong here. You're an outsider, a contaminant." He lunged at me again, knife slashing through the air. I managed to dodge, but my back hit the wall. I was cornered. In desperation, I grabbed a nearby frying pan and swung it with all my might. It connected with a sickening crunch, sending the killer staggering backwards. "Sarah, run!" I yelled. She didn't need to be told twice. She bolted for the door with me right behind her. We burst out into the parking lot, the cool night air a shock after the stifling atmosphere of the diner. I could hear our attacker crashing through the kitchen behind us. "My truck!" I gasped, fumbling for my keys. "We need to—" I never finished the sentence. A deafening bang split the night, and I felt a searing pain in my leg. I went down hard, my knee giving out beneath me. Through a haze of pain, I saw the state trooper from earlier emerging from the shadows, gun trained on us. But something was off about him. His movements were jerky, unnatural, and his eyes had the same manic gleam as our attacker. "Thought you could escape?" the trooper said, his voice flat and emotionless. "No one escapes the New World Order." I tried to get up to reach for Sarah, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The world was starting to go fuzzy around the edges. The last thing I remember is Sarah's scream as the trooper grabbed her and the sight of our original attacker emerging from the diner, knife gleaming in the neon light. Then everything went black. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital 2 states over with more stitches than I could count, and a lot of questions from the FBI. Turns out I'd stumbled into the hunting ground of a pair of serial killers, the trooper and his psychotic partner, who'd been terrorizing truck stops and roadside diners across 3 states. They never found Sarah, or any trace of the other victims from that night. The diner itself was burned to the ground shortly after I was found unconscious in my truck a few miles down the road. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that neon sign flickering in the darkness. Still smell the mixture of grease and death. Still hear Sarah's final scream. I don't do long hauls anymore. Can't bring myself to stop at roadside diners. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive, that I should focus on moving forward. But how do you move forward when every quiet moment brings you back to that night? How do you find peace when you know there are monsters out there wearing the faces of ordinary people? All I know is this. The next time you're driving late at night and see a diner glowing like a beacon in the darkness, keep driving. You never know what's waiting for you behind that door. Story 7. The Wendigo's eyes glowed like embers in the darkness, its antlers scraping the roof of my cab as it loped across the empty highway. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst right through my chest. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start at the beginning. It was just past midnight when I pulled out of the truck stop in Laramie, Wyoming. The coffee I'd grabbed was already cold, but I gulped it down anyway, hoping the caffeine would keep me alert for the long haul ahead. I had to make it over the mountains and into Utah before sunrise if I wanted to stay on schedule. The cab of my Peterbilt felt like a cocoon of warmth against the biting chill outside. Snow was falling in fat, lazy flakes illuminated by my headlights as I climbed into the foothills of the Rockies. The radio crackled with static between stations, so I switched it off, settling into the hypnotic hum of my engine and the rhythmic swish of my wipers. I'd been driving this route for nearly 20 years, and I knew every twist and turn of Highway 80 like the back of my hand. But something felt off that night. The darkness pressing in around me seemed thicker somehow, more alive. I shook my head, trying to clear away the unsettling thoughts. Just my imagination running wild in the quiet of the night, I told myself. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a sign warning of wildlife crossing for the next 5 miles. I eased off the gas a little, keeping my eyes peeled for any deer or elk that might dart out onto the road. The last thing I needed was to wreck my rig hitting some poor critter. The miles ticked by slowly, the monotony broken only by the occasional passing car headed east. I was just starting to relax when movement at the edge of my vision made me tense up again. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkness beyond my headlights. There, just at the tree line, something was moving, something big. At first, I thought it must be an elk, but as it emerged from the shadows, I realized with a jolt of fear that this was no ordinary animal. It stood upright on 2 legs, towering at least 8 feet tall. Its body was emaciated, ribs protruding from leathery grayish skin stretched taut over its skeletal frame. But it was the creature's head that made my blood run cold. Massive antlers sprouted from its skull, easily spanning 6 feet from tip to tip. They were covered in strips of decaying flesh, as if the thing had torn the skin from its own head. Its face was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a mouth full of jagged, yellowed teeth and eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light. I knew in that moment, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that I was looking at a Wendigo. My grandfather used to tell stories about the Wendigo when I was a kid. Creatures born of hunger and desperation, cursed to roam the wilderness with an insatiable appetite for human flesh. I'd always thought they were just tales meant to scare children away from wandering too far into the woods. But the thing standing at the edge of the highway was all too real. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I was frozen in place, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. The Wendigo's glowing eyes seemed to bore into me, filled with a hunger that made my skin crawl. Then, with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so large, it burst into motion. The Wendigo loped across the highway on all fours, its gangly limbs eating up the distance between us in seconds. I snapped out of my paralysis and stomped on the gas, but 18 wheels don't exactly turn on a dime. The Wendigo leapt, sailing over the hood of my truck with impossible grace. I caught a glimpse of its twisted face as it passed over the windshield, close enough that its antlers scraped the roof of my cab with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. Then it was gone, vanishing into the darkness on the other side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my trailer fishtailing slightly on the snow-slicked asphalt. My heart was racing, and I could feel cold sweat trickling down my back. For a long moment, I just sat there, engine idling, straining my ears for any sound over the blood rushing in my ears. Nothing. Just the quiet hiss of snow falling on my warm hood. With shaking hands, I reached for the CB radio. Breaker 1, 9, this is Big Red. Anybody got their ears on? Over. Static crackled for a moment before a voice came through. This is Lone Wolf. What's the word, Big Red? Over. I hesitated, suddenly unsure of what to say. Who would believe me? I just saw something real strange out here on 80, about 20 miles west of Laramie. Thought it might have been an elk at first, but I don't know what it was. Over. There was a pause before Lone Wolf responded. 10-4, Big Red. Lots of weird things out in them mountains. You all right? Over. Yeah, I'm fine, I lied. Just a little shaken up. Keep your eyes peeled if you're headed this way. Over. Will do, Big Red. You be safe out there. Lone Wolf out. I replaced the handset, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to turn around, head back to Laramie and wait for daylight. But I had a schedule to keep, and I'd never hear the end of it if I told my boss I was late because I saw a monster. Taking a deep breath, I put the truck in gear and eased back onto the road. My eyes darted constantly between the mirrors and the tree line, searching for any sign of the Wendigo. But the night remained still and silent as I continued my journey west. As the miles rolled by, I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was more tired than I'd realized, and my mind had played a trick on me. But every time I closed my eyes, even just to blink, I saw those glowing ember eyes staring back at me. I'd just crossed the state line into Utah when my radio crackled to life again. Breaker 1-9, this is Highway Patrol. We've got reports of a multi-vehicle pileup on I-80 westbound near mile marker 5. Roads closed until further notice. All trucks divert to Route 150. Over. I groaned. Route 150 was a winding mountain road that would add at least 2 hours to my trip. But I didn't have much choice. I took the next exit, following the signs for the detour. The 2-lane highway was deserted, snaking its way through dense forest. My headlights barely penetrated the wall of trees on either side, and I found myself hunched forward, straining to see the road ahead. The uneasy feeling from earlier returned, settling in the pit of my stomach like a lead weight. I'd been on the detour for maybe an hour when I saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. For a split second, I thought it was a person. Then I registered the antlers. The Wendigo stood motionless, those burning eyes fixed on my approaching truck. This time there was nowhere to swerve. Trees pressed in close on both sides of the narrow road. I had a split second to make a decision, hit the brakes and risk jackknifing on the icy pavement, or I floored it. The Wendigo didn't move as I barreled towards it. At the last possible moment, just as I braced for impact, it leapt straight up. I felt a thud on the roof of my cab, and then claws were scrabbling at the passenger side window. I swerved, trying to shake the thing off, but it clung on with inhuman strength. The window spider-webbed as it pounded against the glass. I could hear its ragged breathing, smell the stench of rotting flesh as its face pressed against the cracking window. In desperation, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. My trailer swung wide, slamming into the trees with a deafening crash of splintering wood and crumpling metal. The impact sent the Wendigo flying, and I caught a glimpse of it tumbling into the darkness beyond my rearview mirror. I didn't stop to see if it was down for good. I pushed my poor truck to its limits, taking those mountain curves way faster than was safe. It wasn't until I reached the highway again, merging back onto I-80, that I finally let myself relax a little. The rest of the trip passed in a blur. I made my delivery in Salt Lake City just as the sun was coming up, but I barely registered any of it. My mind was still back on that mountain road, reliving those terrifying moments over and over. I've been driving trucks for more than half my life, and I've seen some strange things out on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for that night. I don't know if it was really a Wendigo or some other creature that science hasn't discovered yet. All I know is that I'll never look at those dark mountain highways the same way again. These days, I stick to the southern routes as much as I can, and if I do have to cross the Rockies, you can bet I do it in broad daylight. Because out there in the wilderness, in the depths of the night, there are things waiting in the shadows. Things with glowing eyes and a hunger that can never be satisfied. And sometimes they come down from the mountains to hunt along the lonely stretches of highway where only truckers dare to drive. So the next time you're out on the road late at night and you see something moving in the trees just beyond your headlights, don't slow down. Don't stop to take a closer look. Just keep driving and pray that it doesn't decide to follow you home. Story 8. The snow crunched beneath my boots as I circled my rig, my flashlight beam cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. The tracks were unmistakable, massive 5-toed prints pressed deep into the fresh powder, each one bigger than my entire hand. Whatever had made them, it sure as hell wasn't human. And it had been here, prowling around my truck while I'd slept fitfully in the cab not 10 feet away. Let me back up a bit. The name's Mike Callahan, and I've been hauling freight across the lower 48 for going on 3 decades now. I've seen my share of weird stuff out on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what went down at that lonely rest stop in northern Montana. It was the dead of winter, and I was on a long haul from Seattle to Chicago with a trailer full of electronics. The weather had been dicey since I'd crossed into Montana. Heavy snow and winds gusting hard enough to buffet my rig. By the time I hit the eastern part of the state, I was fighting to keep my eyes open. When I spotted the signs for a rest area coming up, I knew I had to pull over before I ended up in a ditch. The place was deserted when I rolled in, which wasn't too surprising given it was the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. I was grateful for the solitude as I eased my truck into one of the oversized spots and killed the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening after hours of road noise. I didn't even bother climbing into the sleeper. Just tilted my seat back, pulled my jacket tighter around me, and closed my eyes. I figured I'd grab a couple hours of shut-eye and then push on to make up time. Something woke me a few hours later. A sound I couldn't quite place. My eyes snapped open, heart racing as I tried to get my bearings. The cab was freezing. My breath fogged in front of my face. Outside, the world was a blank canvas of white, snow still coming down hard. Then I heard it again, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through the entire truck. My first panicked thought was that a bear had wandered into the rest stop, drawn by the scent of the burrito I'd scarfed down earlier. But this sound? It was deeper, more guttural than any bear I'd ever heard. I sat motionless, barely breathing as I strained my ears. For a long moment there was nothing but the soft patter of snow on the roof. Then a thud against the side of the trailer made me jump. It sounded like something massive had brushed against it. Now, I'm not what you'd call a small guy. I've hauled my share of crates and can hold my own in a bar scuffle, but in that moment I felt about as helpless as a kid hiding under the covers from the boogeyman. Another thud, this one hard enough to rock the entire rig. Then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, torn between curiosity and terror. Eventually, the need to know what the hell was out there overrode my fear. With shaking hands, I reached for the flashlight I keep in the center console. The beam quivered as I played it over the windows, half expecting to see some monstrous face peering in at me. But there was nothing, just an unbroken expanse of white. Screwing up what courage I had left, I cracked open the driver's side door. The hinges creaked in the stillness and I winced at the sound. But nothing came charging out of the darkness to maul me, so I eased myself out of the cab. The snow was mid-calf deep and still falling steadily. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, illuminating the empty parking area and the wall of pines beyond. Nothing moved in the pre-dawn gloom. That's when I noticed the tracks. They started near the back of the trailer and circled the entire rig, weaving between the other empty parking spots. I followed them slowly, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The prints were like nothing I'd ever seen before. Huge and deeply pressed into the snow with 5 distinct toe marks splayed wide. Whatever had made them walked on 2 legs, but sure as hell wasn't human. Each print was easily twice the size of my boot. I'd heard stories, of course. Every trucker has. Tales of Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest or the Fook Monster down in Arkansas. I'd always written them off as campfire stories or the fevered imaginings of drivers who'd been on the road too long. But staring at those tracks in the snow, I couldn't deny the evidence right in front of me. The trail led from my truck to the edge of the woods, then back again in a big loop, as if something had come out of the forest to investigate my rig, circled it a few times, then returned to the trees. I followed the prints to where they disappeared into the thick undergrowth, my flashlight beam swallowed by the darkness between the pines. For a wild moment I considered plunging into the woods after the creature. Then common sense reasserted itself. Whatever had made those tracks was big, and probably not too happy about having its territory invaded. I beat a hasty retreat back to my truck, my eyes darting left and right as I half expected the thing to come bursting out of the trees at any second. I all but dove into the cab, slamming and locking the door behind me. For a long time I just sat there, trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to call it in, to report a Bigfoot sighting or something. But who would believe me? Hell, I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I made a decision. I fired up the engine and pulled out of that rest stop as fast as I safely could on the snow-covered pavement. I wasn't about to stick around and see if my nocturnal visitor decided to make a return appearance. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations as I drove. Maybe it was just some elaborate prank, some local kids with too much time on their hands making fake Bigfoot prints to scare unwary travelers. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The sound I'd heard, the way the truck had shaken, that was no prank. I spent the rest of that trip jumping at shadows, my eyes constantly drawn to the tree line as I drove. Every time I stopped for fuel or food, I found myself scanning the ground for those telltale prints. When I finally rolled into Chicago, nearly a day late and running on nothing but caffeine and adrenaline, I half expected my boss to chew me out. Instead, he took one look at my face and asked if I was okay. I must have looked as rattled as I felt. I thought about telling him the truth, about the tracks in the snow, the growl that still echoed in my dreams. In the end, I just mumbled something about bad weather and mechanical troubles. He nodded, clearly not buying it, but willing to let it slide. That was 3 years ago. I'm still driving, still hauling freight across the country, but things are different now. I find myself avoiding certain routes, certain areas. I don't stop at isolated rest areas anymore if I can help it, especially in the mountains or heavily forested regions. And on those long, lonely stretches of highway, when the darkness presses in close and the shadows seem to move, I can't help but wonder what else might be out there, watching and waiting. I've never seen tracks like that again. Never heard that bone-chilling growl. But I know what I saw that night in Montana. And I know that somewhere out there, in the vast wilderness that still exists in pockets of this country, there are things that defy explanation, things that most people will go their whole lives without ever encountering. So the next time you're driving through the mountains or the deep forests, and you see a truck pulled over in a rest area, maybe think twice before stopping. You never know what might be lurking just beyond the reach of your headlights, leaving tracks in the snow that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the world. As for me, I'll keep driving, keep watching the tree line, and I'll never forget that night when I came face to face, or at least track to boot, with something that shouldn't exist. Because out here on the open road, sometimes the line between legend and reality gets awful blurry. And sometimes, just sometimes, the monsters turn out to be real. Story 9. I've seen that same damn face at gas stations in 48 states now. Always grinning, always wearing that grimy red vest, and always vanishing the moment I look away. I'm starting to think I'm losing my mind out here on these endless highways. But I know what I've seen, and I know it ain't natural. The name's Jack, and I've been driving big rigs across this country for nigh on 25 years now. I've logged more miles than I can count, seen every corner of the lower 48, and had my share of strange encounters. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compares to what's been happening these past few months. It started back in March, at a little no-name truck stop just outside of Tucson. I'd been on the road for 14 hours straight, my eyes gritty with fatigue and my back aching something fierce. When I spotted the glowing sign for fuel and food, it was like an oasis in the desert. The place was empty when I pulled in, just a single flickering light illuminating the pump area. I climbed down from my cab, stretching out the kinks as I walked towards the store. That's when I first saw him. He was standing behind the counter, a middle-aged guy with thinning hair and a paunch straining against his red vest. Nothing remarkable about him, really, just your average gas station attendant. But something about his smile made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Evening," he said as I approached, his grin widening. "Fill her up." I nodded, fumbling for my wallet. "Yeah, and a coffee if you've got it." "Fresh pot just brewed," he said, gesturing towards an ancient-looking coffee maker in the corner. As I poured myself a cup, I could feel his eyes on me. When I turned back, he was still smiling that same unsettling smile. "Long night ahead?" he asked, his voice oddly cheerful for the late hour. "Nah, calling it a night soon," I replied, eager to get my coffee and get out of there. "Just need a boost to make it to the next rest stop." He nodded, still grinning. "Well, you drive safe now. Lots of strange things out there on the road at night." I paid for my fuel and coffee and got the hell out of there, chalking up my unease to too many hours behind the wheel. But as I pulled away, I could have sworn I saw him standing out by the pumps, waving goodbye. I blinked and he was gone. I didn't think much of it at the time. Just another weird encounter in a life full of them. But then, 3 days later, I saw him again. I was in Oklahoma City, fueling up before heading east towards Memphis. Different truck stop, different time of day. But there he was behind the counter, same red vest, same unsettling grin. "Evening," he said, just like before. "Fill her up?" I felt my blood run cold. There was no way, no possible way this could be the same guy. I stammered out a reply, paid for my diesel, and got out of there as fast as I could. But it kept happening. Nebraska, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Georgia. Every state I drove through, at least one gas station would have him there, grinning that impossible grin. Sometimes he'd be behind the counter, sometimes out by the pumps. Once I even saw him mopping the floor of the restroom. But always with that red vest, always with that smile that never quite reached his eyes. I tried talking to other drivers about it, but they just laughed it off. Said I was working too hard, seeing things. Maybe they were right. God knows I wanted them to be. But then came the night in Montana that changed everything. It was a nasty storm, wind howling and snow coming down so thick I could barely see past my hood ornament. I was crawling along at maybe 20 miles an hour, searching desperately for anywhere to pull over and wait it out. When I saw the lights of a gas station through the whiteout, it was like a gift from above. I eased my rig into the lot, the wind buffeting me as I made my way to the store. And there he was, red vest, grin, eyes that seemed to look right through me. "Evening," he said, same as always. "Nasty night out there." I lost it. All the fear, all the confusion of the past few months came boiling up. I lunged across the counter, grabbing him by that damn red vest. "Who are you?" I shouted, giving him a shake. "How are you doing this?" But my hands closed on empty air. 1 second he was there, solid as anything. The next gone, like smoke. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. The store was empty, no sign anyone had been there at all. Shaken to my core, I staggered back to my truck. I couldn't stay there, storm be damned. I had to get moving, had to get away. I made it maybe 5 miles down the road before the whiteout became too much. I pulled over onto the shoulder, flicked on my hazards, and tried to calm my ragged breathing. That's when I saw it. A figure, barely visible through the snow, walking along the side of the highway. As it drew closer, I could make out a familiar red vest. He stopped right beside my driver's side window, that eternal grin plastered on his face. Slowly, deliberately, he raised one hand and waved. I screamed. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Screamed like I hadn't since I was a kid. I threw my rig into gear and floored it, fishtailing on the icy road, but somehow keeping it between the lines. I drove straight through till morning, my knuckles white on the steering wheel, my eyes darting constantly to the mirrors. When the sun finally rose, I pulled into the first diner I saw and tried to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to quit right then and there. Turn in my rig, go home, never set foot in another gas station as long as I lived. But trucking's in my blood, it's all I know. And I'll be damned if I let some smiling ghost or whatever the hell he is run me off the road. So I kept driving, and I kept seeing him. Sometimes weeks would go by without an encounter. Other times I'd spot him 3 or 4 times in a single run. I've tried everything I can think of to figure out what's going on. Taken different routes, avoided chain stations. Hell, I even tried blessing my truck with holy water I bought off the internet. Nothing seems to make a difference. The only constant is that red vest and that unsettling grin. Sometimes I think about trying to grab him again to see if he'd vanish like he did that night in Montana. But truth is, I'm scared of what might happen if my hands don't pass through him this time. I've got theories, of course. Maybe he's a ghost, doomed to haunt gas stations across the country. Maybe he's some kind of demon feeding off the fear and confusion of weary truckers. Hell, maybe I really am just losing my mind after too many years on the road. But deep down, I don't think that's it. There's something about his eyes, something knowing, like he's waiting for me to figure out some cosmic joke. I asked him once during a late-night fill-up in Idaho why he was doing this. Why me? He just smiled that smile and said, "Why not you, Jack?" I never told him my name. So I keep driving, keep watching, keep wondering when I'll see that red vest again. Because I know now that the endless highways of America hide more than just miles. They hide secrets, mysteries, things that don't fit neatly into the world as we know it. And somewhere out there in a gas station that might be in Texas or Maine or anywhere in between, there's a man in a red vest waiting to greet me with a smile that never reaches his eyes. I don't know if I'll ever understand what's happening to me, but I do know this. I'll never look at a gas station attendant the same way again, and neither should you. Because you never know when that friendly face behind the counter might be something more, something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, but does. So the next time you're fueling up in the middle of nowhere and the attendant gives you a smile that seems just a little too wide, well, you might want to pay at the pump and keep on driving. Because out here on the road, reality isn't always what it seems, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. Story 10. The song crackled through my speakers for the 100th time that night, its haunting melody seeping into my bones. I'd changed the station, I'd even turned the radio off completely, but it always came back. The same eerie tune playing on every frequency, following me down this endless stretch of midnight highway. I was starting to think I'd never hear anything else again. My name's Sarah, and I've been hauling freight across the country for the better part of a decade now. I've seen my share of strange things out on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for that night in late October when the music wouldn't stop. It started out as a routine run, just another long haul from Phoenix to Chicago. I'd done this route dozens of times before, could practically drive it with my eyes closed. Not that I would, mind you. As the sun set behind me, painting the Arizona desert in shades of orange and purple, I settled in for the long night ahead. I'm not one for silence when I'm driving, especially at night. The monotony of the highway can lull you into a dangerous trance if you're not careful. So I always keep the radio on, flipping between stations to keep things interesting. That night I started with my usual country station out of Flagstaff. As the familiar twang of guitars filled my cab, I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, feeling the tension of the day start to melt away. But around midnight, as I was crossing into New Mexico, things started to get weird. The country song I'd been listening to faded out, replaced by static. Not unusual for long-haul drives. You're always losing signals and picking up new ones. I reached over to tune in a new station. That's when I first heard it. The melody drifted out of my speakers, soft and melancholic. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before, not quite folk, not quite classical. Just a simple, haunting tune played on what sounded like an old piano. I'm not usually one for that sort of music, but something about it caught my attention. It was beautiful, in a sad sort of way. Made me think of old photographs and faded memories. After a few minutes, though, I decided I needed something with a bit more energy to keep me alert. I changed the station. The song continued playing. Frowning, I tried another station, and another. No matter where I tuned, that same melody came through. Must be some kind of special broadcast, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Probably be over soon. But it wasn't over soon. As the miles rolled by and I crossed the border into Texas, that song kept playing. I tried every trick I knew, adjusting the antenna, pulling over to let the signal reset, even turning the radio off completely for a few minutes. Nothing worked. The moment I turned it back on, there was that melody again. By the time I hit Amarillo, I was starting to freak out a little. It wasn't just that the song was still playing. It was the way it made me feel, like it was trying to tell me something if I could just figure out the message. I pulled into a truck stop, desperate for a break from the music and maybe a chance to clear my head. As I climbed down from my cab, I noticed something odd. The song was playing here too, drifting out from the speakers of every idling truck in the lot. Inside the store, it was coming from the tinny overhead speakers. The cashier, a bored-looking kid barely out of his teens, didn't seem to notice anything unusual. "Hey," I said, setting my coffee on the counter. "What's with this music? It's playing everywhere." He looked at me blankly. "What music?" A chill ran down my spine. "The song that's playing right now, on the radio, on the speakers in here. You don't hear it?" The kid shook his head slowly, giving me the kind of look reserved for people who might be a few sandwiches short of a picnic. "Sorry, ma'am, don't hear anything but the usual top 40 stuff." I paid for my coffee and practically ran back to my truck. This was impossible. How could I be the only one hearing this? As I pulled back onto the highway, the song seemed to grow louder, more insistent. The simple piano melody had been joined by other instruments now, a mournful violin, the low thrum of a cello. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. I tried to focus on the road, on my delivery schedule, on anything but the music. But it was all-consuming, filling my head until I could barely think straight. Somewhere in the panhandle of Oklahoma, I started to hear words hidden in the melody. Not lyrics exactly, but whispers just on the edge of comprehension. They seemed to be calling me, urging me to what? I couldn't quite make it out. I was nearing my breaking point when I saw the hitchhiker. He was standing on the shoulder, thumb out, a battered guitar case at his feet. Normally, I never pick up hitchhikers, too risky in this day and age, but something about him made me slow down. As I pulled over, I realized the music had stopped for the first time in hours. The sudden silence was almost as unnerving as the endless melody had been. The man climbed into the passenger seat, his guitar case cradled in his lap. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "Thanks for the ride," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. Not many folks stop these days. I nodded, too exhausted and unsettled to make small talk. As I pulled back onto the highway, I waited for the song to start up again. But the radio remained stubbornly silent. We drove in quiet for a while, the only sound the hum of my tires on the asphalt. Finally, unable to take it anymore, I blurted out, "Do you know anything about the song?" The old man turned to look at me, one eyebrow raised. "What song would that be?" I told him everything. About the melody that wouldn't stop, about how no one else seemed to hear it, about the whispers hidden in the music. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Music's a powerful thing," he said finally. "Some say it's the language of the universe, and sometimes the universe has something it needs to say to a particular person." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "What's that supposed to mean?" The old man shrugged. "Could mean a lot of things. Maybe you're being called to something, maybe you're being warned, or maybe..." He trailed off, looking out at the dark highway stretching ahead of us. "Maybe what?" I pressed. He turned back to me, his eyes suddenly intense. "Maybe you're being reminded of something you've forgotten, something important." A shiver ran through me. "I don't understand." "You will," he said simply. Then he reached for his guitar case. "Mind if I play a little? Helps pass the time on long drives." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As he tuned his guitar, I found myself holding my breath, half expecting to hear that haunting melody again. But when he started to play, it was just a simple blues riff. Familiar, comforting. We drove on through the night, the old man's music filling the cab. For the first time in hours, I felt myself starting to relax. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, the old man's playing slowed, then stopped. "This is my stop," he said, nodding towards an approaching exit. I pulled over, a strange reluctance coming over me. It felt like I was losing something important, though I couldn't have said what. The old man climbed out, then turned back to me. "Remember," he said, "the song's always there, whether you hear it or not. It's up to you to listen." Then he was gone, walking down the exit ramp as if he had all the time in the world. I watched until he disappeared from view, then slowly pulled back onto the highway. As the sun rose over the plains of Kansas, I turned on the radio. For a moment, there was only static. Then faintly at first, but growing stronger, I heard it. That haunting melody, the one that had followed me through the night. But this time I wasn't afraid. This time I listened. Really listened. And as the music washed over me, I felt something shift deep inside. A memory long buried started to surface. A promise I'd made, a path I'd forgotten. I don't know what it all means yet, but I do know this. That night changed me. Now, whenever I'm out on the road and that song comes on, because it does every now and then, I don't try to change the station. I turn it up and I listen, because sometimes the universe has something to say, and sometimes, if you're lucky, it says it in a song that plays on every station, all through the long, dark night of the soul. Story 11. The neon 24-hour sign flickered weakly as I pulled my rig into the nearly empty truck stop. My eyes burned from the long haul and the fuel gauge needle hovered just above E. I needed this stop, whether I liked it or not. As I maneuvered the truck into position at the pump, a coyote's howl pierced the still desert air. I shivered despite the lingering heat radiating off the blacktop. Something about that sound raised the hair on the back of my neck. The station looked like 100 others I'd seen dotting the highways of the American Southwest. Faded paint, sun-bleached ads for beer and cigarettes plastered on the windows, and an old cola machine humming away near the entrance. But as I stepped down from the cab, my boot crunching on gravel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I swiped my card and started fueling up, the familiar smell of diesel momentarily grounding me. The pump's counter ticked away, but I found my eyes drawn to the darkness beyond the pool of harsh fluorescent light. The vastness of the desert stretched in every direction, broken only by the ribbon of asphalt cutting through the night. That's when I noticed him, the attendant. He was an old-timer, probably in his 70s, with leathery skin that spoke of a lifetime under the merciless sun. He'd stepped out of the station and was making his way towards me with a deliberate, shuffling gait. "Evening," I called out, trying to sound friendlier than I felt. "Everything all right?" The old man's eyes met mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There was an intensity there, a barely contained urgency that set me on edge. "You heading east?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. I nodded. "Yeah, got a delivery in Albuquerque by morning." He glanced over his shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was listening. When he turned back to me, he leaned in close. I could smell tobacco and something herbal on his breath. "Listen carefully, son," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something out there, something that ain't natural. Locals call it a skinwalker." I blinked, thrown off guard. "A what now?" "Skinwalker," he repeated more insistently this time. "Navajo witches that can take the shape of animals. They're bad news, real bad, and there's been sightings lately out on the highway." I forced a chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, man, you trying to scare the out-of-towner?" But the old-timer's face remained deadly serious. "I ain't joking, boy. I've seen things out here that'd turn your hair white. Now listen up, 'cause this might save your life." Against my better judgment, I found myself hanging on his every word as he continued. "They like to target travelers, especially at night. You might see something in the road, a hurt animal or even a person, but don't stop no matter what. That's how they get you." The pump clicked off, startling me. I replaced the nozzle, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to chalk it up to the ramblings of a bored gas station attendant. But there was a conviction in his voice, a fear in his eyes that gave me pause. "If you do see something," he went on, "whatever you do, don't look it in the eyes. They say that's how it steals your soul." A gust of wind kicked up, sending a tumbleweed skittering across the lot. The old man glanced nervously at the darkness once more. "I appreciate the warning," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I really should get going if I want to make my delivery on time." He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for his age. "One more thing," he said urgently. "If you hear whistling on the wind, that's a sure sign one's nearby. You hear that? You floor it and don't look back." I nodded, unsure of what else to say. The old-timer finally released my arm and stepped back, his eyes never leaving mine. "Safe travels," he murmured before shuffling back towards the station. I climbed into the cab, my hands shaking slightly as I turned the key. The diesel engine roared to life, momentarily drowning out the sounds of the desert night. As I pulled out of the station, I caught one last glimpse of the old man in my side mirror. He was standing in the doorway, watching me go. The highway stretched out before me, a dark ribbon under a canopy of stars. I tried to focus on the road, on the familiar hum of tires on asphalt. But my mind kept drifting back to the old man's warnings. Skinwalkers. I'd heard the term before, probably in some late-night documentary or horror movie. But I'd always dismissed it as folklore, the kind of campfire story meant to give kids a good scare. Now, alone on this desolate stretch of highway, those stories didn't seem quite so far-fetched. I flipped on the radio, hoping to distract myself with some music. But all I got was static, punctuated by bursts of garbled voices. After a few minutes of fiddling with the dial, I gave up and shut it off. The silence that followed seemed oppressive, broken only by the rumble of my engine. The miles ticked by, marked by the occasional reflective road sign or lonely cactus silhouetted against the starry sky. My eyes scanned the road ahead, alert for any movement. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. About an hour into the drive, I spotted something in my headlights. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a mirage born of fatigue and an overactive imagination. But as I drew closer, I could make out a distinct shape on the shoulder of the road. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The animal lay on its side, its ribcage exposed to the night air. I'd seen plenty of roadkill in my years of driving, but something about this seemed wrong. The carcass looked too fresh, the wounds too precise. As I passed by, I could have sworn I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Just a slight shifting of shadows, but enough to make my breath catch in my throat. I resisted the urge to look in my rearview mirror, the old man's warnings echoing in my head. Don't look back. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel as I pressed down on the accelerator. The engine growled in response, and I felt a small surge of comfort in its power. Whatever was out there, I told myself, couldn't catch up to 40 tons of speeding steel. But the uneasiness lingered, a constant companion as the miles rolled by. Every curve in the road held the potential for surprise. Every rocky outcropping could be hiding something sinister. I found myself holding my breath as I rounded bends, half expecting to see some monstrous shape looming in my headlights. It was nearing 3 a.m. when I heard it, a faint melodic sound barely audible over the noise of the engine. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe my own exhausted mind playing tricks on me. But as I listened closer, my blood ran cold. Whistling. The old man's final warning rang in my ears. If you hear whistling on the wind, that's a sure sign one's nearby. I scanned the road ahead, my heart pounding in my chest. The whistling grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was an eerie tune, not quite like anything I'd heard before. The melody spoke of ancient things, of secrets buried in the desert sands. That's when I saw it. In the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights, stood a figure. From a distance, it looked human, a person of average height standing unnaturally still. But as I drew closer, I realized with dawning horror that something was terribly wrong. Its proportions were off, limbs just slightly too long, joints bent at impossible angles, and its face. I caught only a glimpse, but it was enough to make my stomach lurch. Where there should have been eyes, nose, and mouth, there was only smooth, featureless skin. I had a split-second decision to make. Every instinct screamed at me to slam on the brakes, to avoid hitting what looked like a person. But the old man's words rang in my ears. Don't stop, no matter what. I gritted my teeth and pressed the accelerator to the floor. The engine roared as the truck surged forward. I braced myself for impact, my entire body tense. But at the last possible moment, the figure moved. It was so fast I could barely track the movement. 1 second it was in front of me, the next it was gone. I caught a blur of motion in my peripheral vision, and then a thud that shook the entire rig. Something had landed on the trailer. The whistling grew deafening, drowning out even the roar of the engine. I fought the urge to look in my mirrors, focusing instead on the road ahead. My hands were slick with sweat on the wheel as I pushed the truck to its limits. I don't know how long I drove like that, my heart pounding, ears straining for any sound over the howl of wind and engine. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. All I know is that gradually, imperceptibly, the whistling began to fade. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. The endless desert gave way to scrubland, then to the outskirts of civilization. By the time I pulled into the delivery depot in Albuquerque, the sun was peeking over the horizon. I completed my delivery in a daze, going through the motions on autopilot. It wasn't until I was checked into a motel room, door locked and curtains drawn, that I finally let it all sink in. Had it really happened? Part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination, a product of too many hours on the road and an overactive imagination. But I couldn't shake the memory of that figure, of the unearthly whistling on the wind. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, I made a silent vow. I don't know if I'll ever drive that stretch of highway again. But if I do, you can bet I'll be stopping at that same gas station. I owe that old-timer a thank you. His warning might just have saved my life. Story 12. The fog rolled in thick as death's shroud, swallowing the lonely stretch of mountain road. My headlights barely penetrated the murk, turning the world beyond my windshield into a swirling gray void. That's when I saw it. A massive, dark shape lumbering across the asphalt. In that moment, I knew my life would never be the same. I'd been driving trucks for over 2 decades, and I thought I'd seen it all. Long nights, crazy weather, idiot drivers, you name it. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that foggy night in the Cascade Mountains. The day had started like any other. I picked up my load in Seattle, a trailer full of electronics bound for a distribution center in Boise. It was a run I'd done 100 times before, a straight shot east on I-90 before heading south. Normally, I'd make it in about 8 hours, give or take a pit stop or two. But Mother Nature had other plans. About 3 hours into the trip, just as I was climbing into the mountains, the weather took a turn. It started with a light drizzle, nothing unusual for the Pacific Northwest. But as I climbed higher, the temperature dropped, and that drizzle turned into a thick, soupy fog. I'd driven in fog before, of course. It's just part of the job when you're hauling freight through mountain passes. But this was different. This fog seemed to have a life of its own, writhing and coiling around my truck like some kind of ethereal serpent. I slowed down, flipped on my fog lights, and leaned forward in my seat, straining to see the road ahead. The world beyond my windshield had disappeared, replaced by an impenetrable wall of gray. I could barely make out the reflective markers on the edge of the road, using them like a lifeline to guide me through the murk. The CB radio crackled to life, startling me in the eerie silence. "Breaker, breaker, any drivers on I-90 eastbound, come in." I reached for the mic, grateful for any human contact. "This is Big Red, eastbound near Snoqualmie Pass. Go ahead." "Big Red, this is Night Owl. Be advised, we've got reports of a mudslide about 10 miles ahead. Highway patrol's saying the road might be closed soon." I cursed under my breath. A road closure would mean hours of delay, maybe even having to turn back. "Thanks for the heads up, Night Owl. Any alternate routes still open?" There was a pause, filled only by static. Then, "There's an old logging road that branches off about a mile ahead. Might be your best bet to get around the slide. But be careful, it's not maintained and this weather ain't helping." I weighed my options. Turning back wasn't really a choice. I had a deadline to meet, and my dispatcher would have my hide if I missed it. And sitting and waiting for the road to clear could take hours, maybe even days. "Copy that, Night Owl. I'll keep an eye out for the turnoff. Much appreciated." "No problem, Big Red. Stay safe out there." The logging road appeared out of the fog like a ghost, a narrow strip of crumbling asphalt branching off from the main highway. I flipped on my turn signal out of habit, though there wasn't another vehicle in sight, and carefully maneuvered my rig onto the side road. Almost immediately, I could tell this was a mistake. The road was barely wide enough for my truck, with a sheer rock face on one side and a steep drop-off on the other. The pavement was cracked and pitted, and in some places had crumbled away entirely, leaving bare patches of dirt and gravel. But I was committed now. Turning around on this narrow strip would be nearly impossible, so the only way out was through. I gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles white with tension, and pressed on. The fog, if anything, seemed to get even thicker. My world shrank to a tiny bubble of visibility, maybe 10 feet in any direction. The trees loomed on either side, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers scraping against the sides of my trailer. That's when I started to get the feeling that something wasn't right. It was nothing I could put my finger on at first. Just a creeping sensation at the base of my spine, a prickling of the hairs on the back of my neck. You don't drive the long, lonely roads as long as I have without developing a sixth sense for danger. And right now, every instinct I had was screaming that something was very, very wrong. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the road ahead, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. My palms were sweaty on the wheel, and I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, though there was nothing to see but swirling gray mist. And then I heard it, a sound so out of place in this foggy mountain wilderness that at first I was sure I must be imagining things. It was a footstep, a heavy, thunderous footfall that seemed to shake the very ground. My first thought was that it must be a landslide starting, some loosened rocks tumbling down the mountainside. But then I heard it again, and again. A rhythmic, deliberate sound that could only be the footsteps of something impossibly large. My heart was pounding now, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I wanted to speed up, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was making that sound as possible. But the road was too treacherous, the fog too thick. One wrong move and I'd send my rig plummeting off the side of the mountain. The footsteps were getting closer now, growing louder with each passing second. They were off to my right, somewhere in the impenetrable fog beyond the edge of the road. Whatever was making them had to be massive. Each impact sent tremors through my truck, rattling the mirrors and shaking loose items in the cab. and then without warning it stepped into view. One moment there was nothing but fog, and the next a dark shape loomed in my headlights. It was enormous, easily 8 or 9 feet tall, covered in shaggy, matted fur. For a split second my mind refused to process what I was seeing. It looked like a man, but impossibly large, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. Bigfoot. The word flashed through my mind, a ridiculous notion that suddenly didn't seem so ridiculous anymore. The creature turned its head towards my truck, and I caught a glimpse of a face that was almost, but not quite, human. Dark eyes glinted in the glare of my headlights, filled with an intelligence that sent a shiver down my spine. For a moment we stared at each other, man and beast, separated by nothing more than a pane of glass and a few feet of foggy air. Time seemed to stand still. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. With shocking speed for something so large, the creature lumbered across the road and disappeared into the fog on the other side. I sat there frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few seconds. My mind was reeling, unable to fully process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of the light and fog, but I knew deep in my bones that what I'd seen was real. Slowly, my senses started to return. I realized I was holding my breath and let it out in a shaky exhale. My hands were clenched so tightly on the wheel that my fingers ached when I finally managed to loosen my grip. I don't know how long I sat there trying to calm my racing heart and make sense of what had just happened. But eventually the reality of my situation started to sink in. I was still on a dangerous mountain road in the middle of a foggy night with a deadline to meet. With trembling hands, I put the truck back in gear and slowly started forward again. Every shadow in the fog looked like a looming figure. Every rustle in the trees sounded like heavy footsteps, but nothing else appeared on the road. By the time I made it back to the main highway, the fog had started to lift. The mudslide had been cleared and traffic was moving again. To the rest of the world, it was just another night on the road. But for me, everything had changed. I'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that shook the very foundations of what I thought I knew about the world. I made my delivery on time, though I couldn't have told you how I managed it. The rest of the trip passed in a blur. When I finally made it home, I sat in my driveway for a long time staring at nothing, trying to make sense of it all. I've made that run through the Cascades many times since that night, and every time as I near that stretch of road, I find myself peering into the shadows, half hoping, half fearing that I'll catch another glimpse of the impossible. But I never have. Whatever I saw that foggy night has remained hidden, leaving me with nothing but memories and unanswered questions. But I know what I saw, and I know that out there in the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, there are things that defy explanation, things that most people will go their whole lives without ever seeing. And sometimes, on long, lonely nights behind the wheel, I find myself envying them. Story 13. The grainy security footage flickered on the ancient monitor, and that's when I saw it. A blur of motion, a flash of inhuman eyes, and then nothing. But in that split second, my entire world turned upside down. I'd come to this backwater gas station looking for a quick caffeine fix. Instead, I found proof that monsters walk among us. Let me back up a bit. Name's Mike, and I've been driving big rigs for the better part of 2 decades. It's a lonely job, but it suits me just fine. I've always been more comfortable with the hum of an engine and the endless stretch of highway than I ever was with people. This particular night started like any other. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Phoenix, a straight shot down I-40. It was about 2 a.m. when I pulled into this little no-name town somewhere in eastern New Mexico. My eyes were getting heavy, and I knew I needed to refuel, both the truck and myself. The gas station was one of those old-school places you don't see much anymore. A single island with 2 pumps, a small convenience store with flickering fluorescent lights, and not another soul in sight. The kind of place that time forgot, left behind by the march of progress. I pulled up to the pump and climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel. The air was cool and dry, carrying the scent of sage and dust. In the distance, coyotes yipped and howled, their cries echoing across the empty desert. As I started fueling up, I noticed something odd. The station looked abandoned, but the pumps were working just fine. I shrugged it off, probably some new automated system, but as the numbers on the pump ticked upward, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Once the tank was full, I made my way to the store. The door creaked open, setting off a tinny bell. The inside was like stepping back in time-faded posters advertising cigarette brands that don't exist anymore. Dusty shelves stocked with off-brand snacks and a cooler humming in the corner. But there was no one behind the counter. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet store. No response. I shrugged and made my way to the coffee pot. It was still warm, thank God. As I poured myself a cup, my eyes fell on something behind the counter. A small security monitor, the screen divided into 4 quadrants showing different angles of the store and pumps. That's when I saw it. In the top left corner, showing the view of the pump I'd just used, there was movement. I leaned in closer, squinting at the grainy black and white image. At first, I thought it was just interference, some glitch in the ancient system, but then I saw it again, a dark shape moving with unnatural speed across the frame. It was there and gone in an instant, but it was unmistakably something. My heart started racing. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But curiosity got the better of me. I looked around, making sure I was still alone, then made my way behind the counter. The security system was old, but not as old as the rest of the place. There was a DVR setup with options to rewind and review footage. My hands shook slightly as I fumbled with the controls, rewinding to the moment I'd seen the movement. There. I hit play and leaned in close, my nose almost touching the screen. The footage showed me pulling up to the pump, getting out, starting to fuel up. All normal. But then, just as I turned my back to the camera to check the pump readout, something entered the frame. It moved like nothing I'd ever seen before. 1 second the lot was empty, the next this thing was there. It was roughly man-shaped, but the proportions were all wrong. The arms were too long, the legs bent at odd angles, and its face, I felt my blood run cold. Where there should have been normal human features, there was just a blur. But for a split second, as it turned towards the camera, I saw its eyes. They glowed with an eerie, animal-like reflection, too large for any human face. I stumbled back from the monitor, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of trick, a prank played by bored locals on unsuspecting truckers. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. The bell over the door jingled, nearly making me jump out of my skin. I whirled around, half expecting to see the creature from the video standing there. Instead, I was face to face with an old man, his weathered face creased with suspicion. "What are you doing back there?" he demanded, his voice gruff. I opened my mouth, closed it, then opened it again. What could I say? That I'd seen some kind of monster on his security camera? He'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. I was looking for someone to pay for my gas. I managed to stammer out. The old man's eyes narrowed. "Uh-huh. And you thought you'd find him hiding in the security tapes, is that it?" I felt my face flush. "No, sir, I thought I saw something strange on the monitor there, in the parking lot." Something changed in the old man's expression. The suspicion faded, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. Fear? Resignation? He sighed heavily and made his way behind the counter. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly, his eyes on the security monitor. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached under the counter and pulled out a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured a generous amount into each and handed one to me. "Drink," he said. "Oh, you look like you need it." I didn't argue. The whiskey burned going down, but it helped steady my nerves. The old man, Jim, he eventually introduced himself as, drained his glass and poured another. "It's been coming around for years," he said, his voice low. "Don't know what it is. Don't want to know if I'm being honest. But it's never hurt nobody, far as I can tell. Just watches." I found my voice at last. What is it?" Jim shrugged. "Some folks call it a skinwalker. Others say it's some government experiment gone wrong. Me? I just call it the night visitor and leave it at that." He told me more over the next hour, nursing his whiskey and speaking in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone that somehow made the whole thing even more terrifying. About how the thing only showed up on camera, never to the naked eye. How animals would go berserk when it was around, even if they couldn't see it. How sometimes in the dead of night you could hear it moving around the station, claws clicking on the pavement. "Why don't you leave?" I asked. "Sell the place. Get out of here." Jim laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And go where? This place is all I've got. Besides," he added, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I tried that once. It followed me." A chill ran down my spine at his words. I glanced at the security monitor, half expecting to see that blurred shape again, but the lot was empty, bathed in the harsh glow of the fluorescent lights. We sat in silence for a while after that, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Jim stood up with a groan, his joints popping. "You should get going," he said. "It's almost dawn and you've got a long road ahead." I nodded, suddenly eager to put this place in my rearview mirror. But as I turned to leave, a thought struck me. "Why'd you tell me all this?" I asked. "You could have just said I was seeing things, sent me on my way." Jim was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the security monitor. "Because," he said finally, "sometimes the knowing is better than the not knowing, even if it keeps you up at night. I left the gas station as the first rays of sunlight were peeking over the horizon. As I climbed into my rig, I couldn't help but take one last look at the store. Jim was standing in the doorway watching me. He raised a hand in farewell, and I returned the gesture before pulling out onto the highway. I've made that run dozens of times since that night, and every time I find myself scanning the darkness beyond my headlights, wondering if I'll catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. I never have, but that doesn't mean it's not out there. Sometimes on long nights when the road seems to stretch on forever, I find myself thinking about Jim and his night visitor, about the things that lurk in the shadows just out of sight. And I wonder, is the knowing really better than the not knowing? I still don't have an answer to that, but I do know one thing. I'll never look at a gas station security camera the same way again. Story 14. I've seen some strange things in my years on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on that remote mountain delivery. When the cabin door swung open and I saw those goat legs, I knew I'd stepped into something straight out of a nightmare. But let me start from the beginning. The day had started like any other. I'd picked up my load in Denver, a bunch of heavy crates marked fragile and this end up, bound for some rich eccentric's cabin in the Rockies. The manifest said it was scientific equipment, but I knew better than to ask questions. In this business, the less you know, the better. The drive started off easy enough. I'd made my way out of the city and into the foothills, the skyscrapers in my rearview mirror gradually replaced by towering pines and jagged peaks. But as I climbed higher into the mountains, things started to get weird. First, it was the GPS. The thing had been reliable for years, but suddenly it started glitching out. The screen would flicker, showing me in the middle of the ocean one second, then in downtown Tokyo the next. Eventually, it just gave up entirely, leaving me with nothing but a signal lost message and a growing sense of unease. I pulled over to check my paper maps. Yeah, I'm old school like that, but they weren't much help. The road I was on didn't seem to exist on any of them. I was about to turn around when I spotted a wooden sign half hidden by overgrown bushes. Eldritch Urdi, private property. That had to be it. I took a deep breath, shifted into gear, and continued up the winding mountain road. The further I drove, the stranger things got. The trees seemed to press in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. More than once, I could have sworn I saw eyes glinting in the underbrush, watching my progress. But every time I looked directly, there was nothing there. The road got narrower and steeper until I was crawling along in first gear, praying I wouldn't meet anyone coming the other way. Not that there was much chance of that. I hadn't seen another vehicle for hours. Just when I was starting to think this whole trip was a mistake, I rounded a bend and there it was. The cabin. Except cabin didn't really do it justice. This place was massive, a sprawling structure of dark wood and stone that seemed to grow right out of the mountainside. I pulled up to what I hoped was the front and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. No birds, no wind in the trees, nothing. Just an oppressive stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I climbed down from the cab, my boots crunching on gravel, and made my way to the front door. It was solid oak, carved with intricate symbols I didn't recognize. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could, the door swung open. And that's when I saw them. The legs, Where there should have been feet and ankles, there were hooves. Shaggy fur covered the legs from the knees down, leading up to a torso that was unmistakably human. My eyes traveled upward, taking in a bare, muscular chest, strong arms, and finally a face that was both familiar and alien. The man, if you could call him that, had sharp features, high cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. And perched atop his head, nestled in a mane of wild hair, were two curved horns. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. I must have fallen asleep at the wheel, crashed my rig, and this was some kind of dying hallucination. The creature, the man, whatever he was, smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It reminded me of a wolf I'd once seen in Yellowstone, right before it pounced on an unsuspecting deer. "Ah," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "You must be the delivery driver, right on time." I tried to speak, but all that came out was a strangled croak. The creature's smile widened, showing teeth that were just a little too sharp to be human. "Come now," he said. "Surely you've seen stranger things in your travels. No? Well, I suppose there's a first time for everything." He stepped back, gesturing for me to enter. My instincts were screaming at me to run, to jump in my truck and get as far away from this place as possible. But my feet seemed to have a mind of their own, carrying me across the threshold and into the cabin. The interior was not what I expected. Instead of the rustic decor you'd expect in a mountain retreat, the place looked like a cross between a mad scientist's lab and an ancient temple. Strange machines hummed and blinked, their purpose a mystery to me. The walls were lined with bookshelves, crammed with volumes in languages I couldn't even identify. "The crates," the creature said, snapping me out of my daze. "Where are they?" In the truck," I managed to stammer. I'll go get them." I turned to leave, relief flooding through me at the thought of being back in the familiar confines of my rig. But a hand on my shoulder stopped me, a hand with nails that were just a bit too long and sharp to be normal. "No need," the creature said. "My assistants will take care of it." As if on cue, I heard movement outside. Through the window, I saw things emerging from the woods. They were roughly humanoid, but hunched and twisted, moving with an unnatural fluidity. I watched in horrified fascination as they swarmed over my truck, effortlessly lifting crates that had taken 2 men and a forklift to load. What are they?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The creature chuckled. "Just some local help, don't mind them." I turned back to him, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind. But before I could voice any of them, he spoke again. "You must have questions," he said, his tone almost gentle. "They all do at first. But trust me when I say it's better not to ask. Safer." He must have seen the fear in my eyes because his expression softened slightly. "Don't worry," he said. "You're in no danger here. Well, no more danger than usual in this line of work." That didn't exactly fill me with confidence. "Look," I said, finding my voice at last. "I don't know what's going on here, and frankly, I don't want to know. I just want to finish this delivery and get out of here." The creature nodded, a look of almost disappointment crossing his face. "Of course," he said. "Business is business after all." He led me to a table covered in papers indicating where I should sign. As I scrawled my name on the delivery receipt, trying to ignore the way the ink seemed to shimmer and move on the page, I couldn't help but ask one question. "Why me?" I said. "Why choose a regular delivery service for whatever this is?" The creature smiled again, but this time it seemed almost sad. "Because," he said, "sometimes the most extraordinary things are hidden in the most ordinary places, and sometimes the most ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things." He must have seen the confusion on my face, because he waved a hand dismissively. "Never mind," he said. "It's not important. What is important is that you've done your job and done it well." He handed me an envelope. "Your payment," he said. "I think you'll find it more than adequate." I took the envelope warily, half expecting it to burst into flames or turn into a snake, but it was just an envelope, albeit heavier than I expected. As I turned to leave, the creature spoke one last time. "You'll want to take the left fork when you reach the bottom of the mountain," he said. "Trust me on this." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and practically ran back to my truck. As I climbed into the cab, I glanced back at the cabin. The creature, the man with goat legs, was standing in the doorway watching me. He raised a hand in farewell, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw sadness in his inhuman eyes. I started the engine and got out of there as fast as I safely could on the winding mountain road. When I reached the fork he'd mentioned, I hesitated for just a moment before taking the left path. I don't know why I trusted him, but something told me it was the right choice. As I drove, the events of the day began to feel more and more like a dream. By the time I reached the main highway, I was half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But then I felt the weight of the envelope in my pocket, and I knew it had been real. I've never opened that envelope, never looked inside to see what kind of payment warranted such secrecy and strangeness. Some things, I've learned, are better left unknown. But sometimes on long night drives when the moon is full and the shadows seem to move in ways they shouldn't, I find myself thinking about that cabin in the mountains, about the man with goat legs and sad eyes. And I wonder what kind of extraordinary things might be hiding in the ordinary world around us, just waiting for the right person to notice. Story 15. The night sky erupted in a blaze of otherworldly light, and for a moment time stood still. There, hovering above the moonlit pasture, was something that defied explanation. I'd seen a lot in my years on the road, but nothing could have prepared me for the sight of that UFO abducting cattle right before my eyes. Let me back up a bit. Name's Jack, and I've been driving big rigs across the country for the better part of 3 decades. I've seen my fair share of strange things in that time. Unexplained lights in the sky, phantom hitchhikers, you name it. But I always prided myself on being a rational guy. There was always a logical explanation, even if I couldn't figure it out right away. That all changed on a crisp autumn night somewhere in the middle of Nevada. I was hauling a load of electronics from San Francisco to Denver, a run I'd done countless times before. It was around 2 a.m., that dead time of night when the world seems to hold its breath. The road stretched out endlessly before me, a ribbon of black cutting through the desert landscape. The radio had long since devolved into static, so I was left alone with my thoughts and the steady hum of the engine. That's when I first noticed the lights in my rearview mirror. At first I thought it was another truck coming up behind me, but as I watched, I realized the lights were too high up to be on the road. My next thought was that it must be a small plane or maybe a helicopter, but it was moving too erratically, darting back and forth in a way that no normal aircraft could manage. I'll admit my heart started racing a bit. I'm not one for conspiracy theories, but in that moment, all those late-night radio shows about UFOs and government cover-ups didn't seem quite so far-fetched. The lights were getting closer now, growing larger in my mirror. That's when I noticed something else. The cattle in the fields on either side of the highway were going berserk. Even over the noise of my engine, I could hear their frantic mooing. They were running in circles, pressing up against the fences like they were trying to escape something. I slowed down, my curiosity getting the better of my common sense. As the truck decelerated, the lights shot overhead, moving so fast they were just a blur. And then, about a quarter mile ahead of me, they stopped. What I saw next will stay with me for the rest of my life. Hovering about 50 feet above a pasture was, well, I guess the only word for it is a spaceship. It was huge, maybe the size of a football field, and shaped like 2 saucers stuck together. It glowed with a soft, pulsing light that seemed to shift colors, blue to green to purple and back again. I brought my rig to a complete stop in the middle of the highway, my jaw hanging open in disbelief. Part of me was screaming to get the hell out of there, to floor it and not look back. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the impossible scene unfolding before me. A beam of light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen, shot down from the bottom of the craft. And then, to my utter astonishment, I saw a cow rising up in that beam, kicking and mooing in terror as it was lifted off the ground. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to capture what I was seeing on video. But as soon as I touched it, the screen went dead. Same with the truck's electronics. The dashboard lights flickered and died, and the engine cut out, leaving me in eerie silence. The cow had disappeared into the craft now, and the beam was moving, sweeping across the pasture. One by one, more cattle were lifted into the air, their terrified bellows echoing across the empty landscape. I don't know how long I sat there, watching in stunned silence as the UFO methodically emptied the field of cattle. It could have been minutes or hours. Time seemed to lose all meaning. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the beam of light retracted. The craft hovered for a moment longer, then shot straight up into the sky at an impossible speed, vanishing among the stars in the blink of an eye. As soon as it was gone, my truck roared back to life, the sudden noise making me jump. The radio came back on too, blaring some late-night talk show like nothing had happened. I sat there for a long time trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Part of me wanted to believe it was some kind of hallucination, a waking dream brought on by too many hours on the road. But I knew deep in my bones that what I'd seen was real. Finally, I put the truck in gear and slowly rolled forward. As I passed the pasture where the abduction had taken place, I could see the remaining cattle huddled together in one corner, still visibly shaken. The field, which had been full of livestock just a short time ago, now looked eerily empty. I briefly considered stopping, maybe trying to find the farm's owner to report what had happened. But what would I say? "Excuse me, sir, but I just saw a flying saucer make off with half your herd. They'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. So I kept driving. The sun was starting to peek over the horizon by the time I reached the next town. I pulled into a truck stop, desperate for a cup of coffee and some human contact. The place was nearly empty at that early hour, just a few other drivers nursing cups of coffee and a sleepy-eyed waitress behind the counter. I ordered the largest coffee they had and slumped into a booth, my mind still reeling from the night's events. "Rough night?" the waitress asked as she set the steaming mug in front of me. I looked up at her, wondering how she'd react if I told her the truth. Instead, I just nodded. "You could say that." She gave me a sympathetic smile. "Well, the coffee here'll put hair on your chest, or take it off, depending on how you look at it. Either way, it'll wake you up." As she turned to leave, something on the TV above the counter caught my eye. It was a local news report showing footage of a field that looked eerily familiar. Local rancher reports mysterious disappearance of livestock overnight. Authorities are baffled by the lack of evidence. I stared at the screen, my coffee forgotten. It was the same field, the same pasture where I'd witnessed the impossible just a few hours ago. The waitress noticed my interest. "Crazy stuff, huh?" she said. "They're saying it might be rustlers, but I've never heard of rustlers taking that many cattle without leaving a trace." I nodded mutely, not trusting myself to speak. The reporter was interviewing the rancher now, a grizzled old man who looked like he'd seen it all. Until now. "I've been ranching these lands for 40 years, he was saying, his voice gruff with emotion. "Never seen anything like this. It's like they just vanished into thin air." If only he knew how right he was. The waitress shook her head. "Things have been weird around here lately. Lights in the sky, strange noises at night. My cousin swears he saw something that wasn't a plane or a helicopter out by the old Miller place last week." I looked at her sharply. "You believe in that stuff, UFOs and all that?" She shrugged. "I don't know what I believe, but I know there's more to this world than what we can explain. And out here in the desert, well, let's just say the line between what's possible and what's not gets a little blurry sometimes." I finished my coffee in silence, mulling over her words. As I stood to leave, I found myself asking her one last question. "If you saw something impossible," I said, "would you tell anyone?" She studied me for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Depends," she said finally. "Would anyone believe me if I did?" I nodded, understanding all too well what she meant. "Thanks for the coffee," I said, dropping a generous tip on the table. As I walked back to my truck, I made a decision. I wouldn't tell anyone what I'd seen that night, not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, but because I wasn't sure I was ready to live in a world where such things were possible. But I knew one thing for certain: I'd never look at the night sky the same way again. And every time I passed a pasture full of cattle, I'd find myself looking up, wondering if I'd see those strange lights again. Because once you've seen the impossible, you can never truly unsee it. And somewhere out there, beyond the stars, I knew there were beings with technology far beyond our understanding. Beings who, for reasons I couldn't fathom, had developed a taste for beef. As I climbed into my rig and started the engine, I couldn't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. Here I was, a simple truck driver, carrying the secret of extraterrestrial life along with my cargo of electronics. Just another day on the road, I supposed. Just another strange tale to add to the many I'd collected over the years. But this one, I knew, would stay with me forever. The night the sky opened up and the cows flew away,